It was a very moving story. I wonder if you've discovered what he had against the Amish people.
Yeah, okay. Let me say it. He left letters for Marie, his wife, and for his kids. And in the letter, he said that he is angry at God because God took their firstborn, who only lived 2 or 3 days. And so he was holding this anger. And what's ironic about this whole story, which eventually became a big forgiveness story, is he could not let go of that. He was holding on. He was bitter. He was angry at God. He couldn't forgive God. Now, I have problems with his theology. But nevertheless, that was his theology, where he was holding God accountable for taking their firstborn. And what's odd about that is they had 3 other healthy children that were doing well. But in his note, he said, every time I think when we go on a family event, and I forget her name, it's slipping my mind, let's say Isabel couldn't go along. This is the one that died early. I just get all upset about it and just angry at God. Amish Victoria. Why she can't be with us. So we think what was going on in his mind was that the best way to get back at God is to shoot some of the most innocent of the innocent little girls. And he's living in an area where there are Amish schools, and so we think that's what was going on. He doesn't say that in the letter, but it's a way. He can't think of a meaner thing to do to get back at God. Now, some people say, well, this is male on female violence, and it's not an Amish story. And in some ways, that's correct. I think the Amish children just happen to be victims. There was an Amish school closer to his home, but it was close to other houses, and he would have much more likely been detected doing it, at least early on initially. But thanks for asking. Yes?
I want to know about, do you know anything about how the little girls reacted when they were inside, when he started shooting, were they? Because I know that they believe, in peace, and I wonder if...
Well, I can say that, I can say a couple things. I wasn't there, and the only information we have is from some of the surviving girls. Okay, and I have not interviewed any of them. We know that the oldest girl, we're not sure exactly what he said to them, okay? But at one point, the oldest girl, so 14-year-old, she says, shoot me first. And we don't know if she meant shoot me instead of raping me, or shoot me so you don't have to shoot the others.
I'm sure she meant shoot me so
but
shoot the others.
We don't know. Now, Amish families are large, and so the older kids feel responsible. And I think she spoke up before because she felt there's no teacher here, so she's kind of in charge of the girls. And she's the one that died. I mean, he didn't shoot her. I'm not sure where she was in the lineup, but eventually he shot her and she died on the spot. They also said that they would pray for him and talk to him about that. And then I don't recall offhand what his response was to that. So those are 2 of the things that, I mean, there was some exchange, before he shot them, and there may have been other conversations, but the only people that will have a memory of it would be the surviving girls, and you can imagine it was a traumatic time for them, and so I don't know exactly what all they remember. Yes?
Doctor, who and what were your sources for writing this book?
I work at the Young Center. It's a research institute at Elizabethtown College, and we are sort of the premier national institute for studying Amish, Mennonites, Hutterites, and Brethren in North America. And so the moment the shooting started and it hit the news, we started getting calls. And so I started getting calls. I didn't know where the school was, and yet I was answering calls in the afternoon. And And so by 5 or 6 o'clock that evening, there were more than 30 big RVs with their big antennas and dishes very close to the school where they were parked on the road. I didn't go down that night, but I went at 6 a.m. Tuesday. And so at that point I was doing interviews with a lot of the media. And at that point I wasn't thinking about doing a book. I would say the idea of a book, actually 3 or 4 days later than that, probably Thursday of that week, I got a call from a book agent in New York City, said that, he wants to send me a contract for a book, that he wants me to investigate the killer and his mind and the psychology of this. He wants it to be a book like In Cold Blood, which Cody had done. And I was kind of like, I said, yeah, well, send me the contract. I was just curious what the contract would look like. Well, then I called him back and I said, I can't do this. I said, I might be open to doing something about forgiveness at some point, but I'm not going to do the thing. He said, well, that's fine. We'll get somebody from Philadelphia, from the newspapers to do it, but I don't think they ever did. About 3 weeks after that, I was at a benefit auction for nickel mines, and there were media coming there, and some of the Amish people who were friends of mine asked if I would come and just sort of shield them from the media that day and answer questions to the media so the Amish didn't have to deal with them. And at that point, I met a member of the local nickel mines fire company, the Bark Fire Company, and he said, why don't you come down someday, so I'll take you around. So he took me around. I met 5 or 6 different families. This was about 3 weeks after the event. And then I gradually, at the encouragement of other people, decided I should be working on a book. And I ended up then interviewing about 3 dozen Amish people, including all the families except one. Now, I didn't interview the families actually until January, February. It was just like I just couldn't bring myself to go and, I just felt like if this had been my daughter, the last thing I want is some journalist coming in and trying to interview me, 3 or 4 weeks later. So I interviewed a lot of other people and basically got the details I needed for the story, and then later in January and February I interviewed the families. The press did a phenomenal job. Actually, I should say 3 of us were writing the book. We were at 3 different geographical locations. We wrote that book in 10 weeks. I still don't understand to today how we were able to do it. And you have to make your own judgment, but looking back, I think it's a pretty good book. And to harmonize 3 authors and get the voice to be consistent is really hard work. I was in Elizabethtown. One was west of Harrisburg, and the third one was in Indiana. And we had one meeting in December to kind of lay out what we wanted to do, but we never met again face to face. We had a weekly telephone call, a conference call for an hour or 2 hours, and then we would draft material and send it around so that, so anyway, that sort of is how the book developed, and we transmitted the manuscript April 1, but I hadn't started writing until the middle of January. And if any of you have written books or anything about writing a book, I honestly still don't know how we did it. I actually, when I give this talk, I have difficulty cheering up, and I think some of it is like sort of deferred grief, because I wasn't able to grieve. That whole 10 weeks I'm in the schoolhouse thinking about what's going on, but I couldn't let my emotions come to the surface because I wouldn't have been able to make the deadline. And so I think some of this, even that you're feeling tonight, is, I don't know, still some delayed grief. It is a horrific story, but I feel like after having told it 75 times, I ought to be able to tell it without getting teared up. So, yes, ma'am.
Doctor, you mentioned that there were 2 women that were inside
Yes.
the classroom, but you didn't indicate what happened to them.
He chased them out. He ordered them out. Once the teacher ran and her mother, he ordered the boys and the 2 women out.
Pardon me.
That's when the little girl escaped.
Okay, and then the second question gentleman had been treated for mental health?
No, there's none. I actually interviewed his wife, and by the way, she just had a book come out in October. It's called A Light Still Shines or something like that. Marie Mon,
One light,
One Light Still
still
Shines.
shines.
Marie Monville, she was remarried after the event. But I had about a year and a half.
I'm speaking as a spouse of someone who has mental illness, that's why.
Yeah. She said this caught her completely by surprise. He wasn't in counseling. He was introverted and shy by his very nature, you know, and didn't say a lot, but he wasn't in therapy, and I mean, it caught her completely off guard. So, yes, sir.
I can see the innocent wife being forgiven and his parents being forgiven.
Okay, well, go ahead, and I want to make a comment about that already.
Sure. And you may talk about this later, but I'm wondering if he would have lived through this ordeal, would the Amish have forgiven him directly?
Let me first speak to his wife. I had an email conversation with her early on. I mean, maybe this is maybe 3 or 4 weeks after the event, and she said, people keep forgiving me, and she said, I don't know why they do it, because I didn't do anything bad. And the point is, she was a victim as much as anybody. And in any event like this, there are circles of victims. It's rare to have a crime, or rare to have such a major infraction where there's only one victim. There's usually circles of victims. And one of the Amish men that I interviewed said, Don, I think the Roberts family has a bigger burden than we do. And he said, they have the shame and the embarrassment of this whole thing. He said, we lost our girls, and that was very painful, but they, you know, carry the blame for this, and the shame, and so on. And so that was a very, I thought, empathetic comment from the Amish perspective. Now, remind me what your question was.
Sure.
I don't think I got to the real...
I recognize that the wife was
Yes.
innocent in the crime and the parents were innocent in the crime.
Yes.
But would the Amish have forgiven the perpetrator had he lived?
Yes, okay. I asked all of them, what do you think should have happened to Charlie if he had lived? And they said, well, we think he should go to prison. He should clearly be in prison so he doesn't do this to other people. Now, they would make it, and I'm getting into my second point, the second part of the talk, in terms of what is forgiveness, but the Amish, and I think rightly so, would make a distinction between forgiveness and holding someone accountable, or forgiveness and justice, or forgiveness and punishment, okay? So in their mind, I think even if he would have lived, they would have said, we work to forgive him, we want to forgive him, but nevertheless we hold him accountable for what he did and feel the state has a right to punish him, is how they would have talked about it or thought about it. Yes, sir.
Dr. I'm very close with the Amish community. 2 of my best male friends are Amish. They live in Kinzard, which is near Gap. And the next day I spoke with them on the phone, and the first utterance that my friend John, the father of 14 children, they're all now grown up, and 2 of his boys whom I spoke with, and I visited them a few days later, were the words forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
And I was dumbfounded by that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a few weeks later, I went to visit them, and I was there on the weekend. We played a table game, and the young men in their 20s, they had some fire in them, but they were very dignified and controlled and spiritual, and you know, they were asking questions about, well, how can this happen? He must have had a mental problem or something. But the thing that impressed me so much was that the first 2 conversations I had with John and 2 of his sons in their 20s, and the first thing out of their mouth was, you know, we forgive him. And this was before they had any district meetings. You know, they had
Right,
they were in the district and they had their church meetings, and before they could really communicate with one another by telephone. And you know, they write letters, as you know. And, and I was just so impressed with that spiritual basis and reaction to that terrible bludgeoning.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And See, the interesting thing also in the story is that, well, some psychologists would say forgiveness can only be transacted between the offender and the victim. Okay, that the two have to. And what happened here was, well, who are the victims? 10 innocent little girls, 5 of which are dead, and 5 are in their hospitals fighting for their lives. And what about the offender? He's dead. So does that mean it's not possible to have forgiveness in this situation? And the parents aren't really engaged in the forgiving at first. I mean, they are at the hospitals. They are focused on funerals. The funerals for the Amish girls were Thursday and Friday. And so you have, it's kind of like a third-party forgiveness where people from the Amish tribe came over to the Roberts tribe and said, look, one of your guys did something really bad to us, but we're not going to try to retaliate, and we're not going to try to get back at you. We're going to still respect your tribe, even if you did such a bad thing. So it's like a third-party, tribe-to-tribe kind of forgiveness, because the primary actors, the offender and the victims, aren't in any way possible to engage in it. Yes, and then 2 more, and then I want to move on, okay?
Did this man, Charlie, doctor, actually state in any of his letters that you're aware of that he went out specifically to murder, or did the law enforcement incite him to the point that if that's what he did? What did something?
Yeah, I think he was, I mean, this is very deliberately planned. I think, given his letter, he wanted to do something that would be what he thought the best way to get back at God, whether it's raping the girls or killing them, I don't know. So we don't really know. So I have to leave it at that. I did want to, somebody asked about forgiving, I think it was you. I did want to say this, that 2 of the mothers told me in different times that if he had raped our daughters, it would have been a lot harder for us to forgive. And so they were putting some, that's just what they said. And I think we can understand why it would have made it more doable. Yes?
So, I'm just wondering what the act of forgiveness and grieving. I'm thinking about like how interesting it was that immediately, you were speaking about immediately these men, the Amish men went to the families and, embraced them and said, we forgive you. And I was thinking about how long it takes for some of us to get to that place of forgiveness. And so where is the grieving? It doesn't, I can't imagine like just, an hour later going to someone and saying, there's got to be some grieving. And where was that and how long was that?
Well, I would say the grieving, I think Amish people, what I witnessed in their response was that the grieving and the forgiving was all mixed up and blended together. I mean, there were, believe me, this wasn't just a mechanical, robotic sort of response. I mean, there were tears and crying and one, I interviewed one man, Amish man, who lived about 10 miles away that wasn't really closely involved in this. And he said, Don, every morning I get up, I have to start all over again with forgiveness. I mean, he didn't lose a daughter or a family member, but he's angry about this 10 miles away. But his point was, it's not a once and done thing. It's kind of like, well, I forgive them, I'm moving on, blah, blah. But it's a journey, it's a process. Now, I would say one way in which the Amish practice is different than ours is we might be grieving for a long time and then start moving toward forgiveness. I gave a lecture about this topic, similar church, Episcopal, but another church. And afterwards, a woman came up to me and said, Don, this story means so much to me. Because she said, finally last week, I was able to forgive the man that murdered my daughter 9 years ago. And that is the more typical journey. And what the Amish do is flip it upside down. They feel, and I'll explain in a few moments, for theological reasons, why they should forgive. And so they do the forgiveness. I mean, they say it and then work at the grieving and trying to keep on forgiving. Whereas I think the more individualistic American Christian model is we say, well, forgiveness is a good thing, but well, I just can't get there now. I'm just filled with resentment, anger, and bitterness. And we hope some point we can get on the journey that leads us toward forgiveness and then eventually get there. And the Amish sort of flip it upside down because of their commitment to do it. So they do it, but then keep trying to stay on the journey. I don't know if that makes sense. Okay. Then your last, and we'll come back for a circle again. I'm sorry.
It's just a quick question more about the crime itself.
Yes.
Did the police manage the situation the right way?
The police,
or could they have managed it differently?
they could not have managed it any better. They did an exceptional job. And I happen to know the commissioner of police, of the state police, because he was a graduate of Elizabethtown College. And I talked with him afterwards. Actually, we had 2 or 3 years later, had him at the Young Center where I teach like an evening meeting with the parents. And he really developed a close relationship. He said I, as the police commissioner of the state of Pennsylvania, was very fortunate this man killed himself. Because then I could get up and do press reporting almost every hour. And that really helped the Amish because you have hundreds of reporters there. I mean, there were hundreds of reporters, print and video, television reporters. And, they stayed on through the week, which kept the story alive because the funerals were coming up. The Amish girls were buried Thursday and Friday, and Charlie Roberts was buried Saturday. And so their editors said, look, just stay and get the story. Well, what do they do between Tuesday and Thursday? It's kind of like they have to file something every night. And so what they would have liked to have done is interviewed Amish people and walk in their farms and so on. The police really worked effectively to prevent that, but the commissioner said what really made it easier was he could update everything they knew all the time publicly. And so the reporters had something to say and didn't have to harass the Amish. An example of this, a symbolic example of the police management was for the funerals, the funeral procession came down through Georgetown and turned right and went out about a mile into the country where the Amish cemetery was. And the police had 4 mounted horses. And I moved by this because an Amishman told me this story, and he couldn't get through the story. He said, so at the head of the caravan you have 2 mounted police officers, at the back 2. And so it's symbolic of Amish life to have these horses. But it also was protection because there were a lot of people there, news media there. There was a no-fly zone over the cemetery, but the Washington Post violated it with a little plane and got up there and got in quick and got a photo and got out. But then when they got into the cemetery, the horses turned like this, facing out at the entrance. Again, to the Amish, it was like a symbol of protection. So, to the person, the Amish are just very grateful to the state police and thought they did an excellent job. They actually made one man did a large wood carving, burnt wood, for the police. I mean, there were a lot of good relationships. The police, when the new school was built, the New Hope School, brought the cruiser there, let the kids get in and, turn on the whistles and sirens and lights and so on. So it was a very positive relationship.
And I would imagine it must have been a very difficult situation for the police to not have been able to prevent what happened.
You know, the Westboro Baptist Church, is that, am I getting the name right? They were coming in, they were gonna obstruct the funeral. This is the group in Kansas that, you know, has an agenda against gay rights. So they were coming, and there's a large motorcycle gang heard about this that has gone to some other places where they show up because they rev their engines really loud, so nobody can hear the chants, you know, from the Westboro Baptist folks. So the motorcycle gang was coming, and the state police were on top of this, but finally, I think a couple hours before they came, the Westboro folks came, a news talk show in New York agreed to have the Westboro folks on for an hour, give them an hour free airtime if they didn't come. So they never came, but the motorcycle guys came. So I think they were disappointed. But, okay, I'd like to move on now and talk a little bit more about forgiveness, and then we can take some more questions.